Mount Hood is one of America's most dangerous volcanoes. And in this episode of What If, we're going to explore what would happen if it were to erupt today. In 1792, a series of earthquakes struck the Pacific Northwest, and people in the area reported seeing smoke rising above Mount Hood. But when explorers finally reached the mountain, they found no sign of an eruption. So who are we kidding? It's not like an Oregon volcano is going to blow up anytime soon, right? Well, actually, it might have already started. As the explorers were finding out, Mount Hood is home to one of the most dangerous types of eruptions that scientists can imagine, a silent eruption. These volcanoes don't give any warning signs except for small changes in the landscape, which could easily go unnoticed until it's too late. But before we get into how a silent eruption would affect the Pacific Northwest, let's take a moment to discuss why Mount Hood is so volatile. Located about 50 miles south of Portland, Mount Hood is one of 3 active volcanoes in Oregon, the others being Crater Lake and Mount Jefferson. Though it might look pretty chill, it's anything but. Since 1790, Mount Hood has had several small eruptions, including one in 1812 that sent ash all the way to Europe. Today, more than 1 million people live within 100 miles of Mount Hood, many of them in the Portland metro area. And while experts say that a major eruption is unlikely in our lifetimes, it's impossible to say when the next one will occur or how big it'll be. Now, Mount Hood isn't like your typical volcano. It has a very real potential for what is known as a phreatic eruption. Unlike traditional magma-based eruptions, these explosions are caused by the interaction between water and superheated rocks deep underground. The resulting steam blasts can hurl solid objects like volcanic bombs for miles. In fact, pumice from Mount Hood has been found as far away as California and Nevada. The danger of Mount Hood was brought home in 1980 when thousands of people living near Mount St. Helens had to be airlifted from their homes after that volcano erupted. Luckily, none of those 2,000 residents were seriously hurt, but it was still the deadliest U.S. volcanic eruption in over 100 years. If Mount Hood were to blow up tomorrow, it wouldn't be like Mount St. Helens. Experts agree that it would be much more like the 1815 eruption of Mount Kelut in Indonesia. Mount Kelut is a stratovolcano, which means it has steep sides and is made up of alternating layers of ash and lava. The 1815 eruption of Mount Kelut was considered intermediate in size, medium rare. So what does that mean for the Pacific Northwest? Let's take a look at the immediate aftermath. The first thing to go would be the small town of Hood River, Oregon, located just east of the volcano. Even worse, a significant portion of Interstate 84 would be destroyed, cutting off easy access to the Columbia River. To the north, the cities of the Dalles and Bingen would likely be buried in ash and pumice. And here's where things start to get weird. Because Mount Hood is a stratovolcano, its slopes are actually relatively stable. That means that once the initial blast wave subsides, there would probably be a brief window of calm before the real danger arrived. Pyroclastic flows are hot, dense mixtures of rock fragments and gases that flow down the slopes of a volcano during an eruption. They move extremely fast, reaching speeds of up to 430 miles per hour. Imagine the fastest roller coaster you've ever been on. Now, imagine that going twice as fast. Pyroclastic flows are responsible for most of the damage done by volcanoes, and depending on wind conditions, they can travel far beyond the immediate vicinity of the volcano. Residents of Portland and Vancouver would only have about an hour to get out before these superheated avalanches of rock reach the Columbia River. Thankfully, most of the population would have plenty of warning. Local emergency sirens would sound, and a message would appear on every television and radio broadcast in the area telling people to evacuate immediately. That hour would be enough time for most people to get to safety, but it wouldn't be enough time for everyone. Those with mobility issues, the elderly, pets or young children would struggle to escape in time. Even if they did make it to safety, their lives would never be the same. The ash cloud alone could blanket an area the size of Connecticut in a layer of debris. And that's just the stuff you can see. Volcanic ash is made up of tiny particles of pulverized rock and glass that are too small to be seen without a microscope. These microscopic pieces of debris would combine with water vapor in the air to form a thick grey cloud. Ash clouds are dangerous because they can cause respiratory problems even days after an eruption. People would need to stay indoors with their windows closed until the cloud passes, and even then, they should keep their doors and fireplaces shut because breathing the air outside would be like inhaling broken glass. And even if you manage to avoid the pyroclastic flows and the ash cloud, there's still the matter of the lahar. Lahars are volcanic mud flows that typically occur after a large eruption. When hot ash and rock meet a body of water, it can form a slurry of volcanic debris and water that rushes downstream. Lahars can travel tens of miles in just a few hours, and they carry with them everything from small pebbles to giant boulders. They're especially dangerous because they move incredibly fast, often faster than the current of a river itself. Residents living along the sandy river would need to evacuate immediately when they saw the dark cloud forming in the distance. And if they moved fast enough, they might make it to higher ground in time. Otherwise, they might find themselves buried in a thick layer of mud. Okay, so maybe you survived the initial eruption. Congratulations, you win the survival lottery. But it's not over yet. Volcanic winters occur when an eruption throws enough debris into the atmosphere to block sunlight and cool the planet. Although a single eruption can't cause ice to form in your backyard, it can lead to temperatures dropping below freezing for extended periods of time. The year 1816 is a famous example of volcanic winter in action. Also known as the year without a summer, it followed the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia. Global temperatures dropped as much as 8 degrees Fahrenheit below normal. In the northern hemisphere, summer temperatures were close to those of an average winter day. Though we'd likely see nothing that extreme following an eruption of Mount Hood, winter would come early and last longer than usual. Residents would need to rely on their emergency food stores and heating systems to survive. Farmers would lose their crops and the economy would screech to a halt. You'd also have to worry about another eruption. Some volcanoes have multiple eruptions during what scientists call a volcanic event. This means that although you might survive the first eruption, you could be in danger again if there's a second or third explosion. It's possible that Mount Hood could continue to erupt for weeks or months. In fact, the 1815 eruption of Mount Kelut had 7 episodes over 2 years. Scientists don't know exactly how long an eruption of Mount Hood would last, but it could continue for weeks or even years. So while the people of the Pacific Northwest would likely have some warning that an eruption was coming, they wouldn't know how long it would last or how strong each eruption would be. So could you actually survive an eruption of Mount Hood? If you live in the Portland metro area, your best chance of survival would be to drive east across the Cascade Mountains. This route would take you through several mountain passes that are at least 3,000 feet above sea level, meaning you'd be far enough away from the volcano to avoid the worst of the pyroclastic flows and lahars. But the volcanic winter that follows the eruption would affect the entire region. No matter where you went, you couldn't escape the ash cloud, the deadly combination of ash and water vapor that would blanket the Pacific Northwest. Even if you made it to safety, you'd be without power, food, or water for at least several weeks. If you weren't prepared for an emergency of that magnitude, you could end up dying from cold exposure or dehydration. A major eruption of Mount Hood would change the Pacific Northwest forever. Cities would be completely covered in ash. Thousands would lose their lives and the economy would fall into chaos. But according to experts, this scenario is unlikely to occur anytime soon. The real danger is in the silent eruptions that go unnoticed. These eruptions can cause serious damage, but they aren't accompanied by the same level of destruction as a major eruption. One of the biggest problems is that not enough people take them seriously. In 2014, scientists found evidence of a silent eruption that had occurred between 2004 and 2008. It was only discovered because researchers were studying the lava lake at the top of the volcano and noticed that it had changed shape. When something like that happens, it's important to investigate because it could be the first sign of a more serious problem. In 2011, scientists analyzed gas samples from the summit crater and found that there was a lot more sulfur dioxide in the air than usual. This could indicate magma was rising from deep within the earth and mixing with water. The result, a steam explosion. In order to prevent the loss of life and property, it's important that scientists can predict when these eruptions will occur, but predicting when a silent eruption will happen is almost impossible. That's why it's so important to monitor the volcano regularly. Researchers check the ground for seismic activity, measure the temperature of the lava lake, and analyze gas samples on a regular basis. This helps them identify any changes that could indicate an impending eruption. It's a relief that experts are keeping tabs on Mount Hood, but it doesn't mean we should let our guard down. A quiet eruption could catch us off guard, but the good news is that ash from an eruption would eventually turn into a valuable resource for farmers. Volcanic ash is rich in nutrients like potassium, phosphorus, and magnesium, meaning it can make plants grow faster and larger. The bad news is that it takes decades for the ash to break down enough to be used. In the meantime, you'll want to steer clear of gardening with your kids, unless you want them to learn about long-term health effects of breathing in volcanic ash.